And so, uh, gosh, Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are here. I thought Nancy was in Taiwan stirring up trouble. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise to you, depending on how close you follow immigration things that are happening. But I've come to the conclusion of, after practicing immigration law for almost 50 years, that we have to abolish the system. And because the entire thing is broken, and people here, you may want to debate with me, but you're not going to convince me otherwise. And I want to explain a few things to you, different topics that I want to cover that will help explain why I've come to that conclusion. And I'm not a PowerPoint person, but Angelina emailed me a couple of days ago when I was up in Humboldt County in the Redwood Forest, saying, "Do you have anything you want?" I said, "Just put up a sign that says abolish ICE." But when I got in front of a computer today, I said, maybe I can do something else. And so to me, a picture is always worth 1,000 words. And so I have 7 or 8 photos that will spark my conversation. So the first photo is of kids in cages. And I've been to ICE detention centers on a number of occasions. The immigration clinic at USF, before the pandemic, regularly sent our attorneys and students to volunteer at family detention centers in Texas. There's 2 family detention centers in Texas and 1 in Pennsylvania. And the one that I went to was called Dilley, Texas. And there is a room about this big, at this pre-pandemic, when groups of probably 40 to 50 women, it was a family detention center that held women and children, would go through an orientation, a charla, and they would be told what the procedure was going to be and what was going to happen. And then they would have another meeting a couple of days later. And so I saw these series of meetings going. What we did was screen them and find out what kind of asylum claim they might have and give them advice. And students would actually represent the women, often in their bail hearings, but also credible fear interviews. At that time, they were able to be released and then move on to other parts of the country. And that's actually why we started the immigration clinic at USF, because the city actually provides funding for 13 different agencies in San Francisco to provide representation to folks mostly applying for asylum, not entirely, but mostly applying for asylum, and many unaccompanied minors. And so I thought that when I went to Dilley, I thought that was the worst I would ever see. Room full like this of women with children, and the children were not energetic. They were lethargic. They were not what you would call fun-loving, because they were detained. They were it was a dormitory type situation, but they weren't free to go anywhere, and it was a pretty miserable situation. And I remember thinking about my daughter-in-law and my granddaughter at that time, who was about 2 or 3 years old, and imagining them there. But how lucky, my granddaughters are, how they can be kind of normal and play around. And so I thought that was bad. But then 3 years ago, I got a call from an attorney, 2 attorneys, Peter Shea and Carlos Holguin, who are the attorneys who represent, they're in charge of a case called the Flores case. And you can Google that later. The Flores case is a case that started in the 1980s when this young girl, Lizette Jenny Flores, um, somehow got word to Carlos Holguin that she was detained by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, this pre-ICE. And she wanted to get out. What Carlos found out was that really they were detaining her because she had come with an uncle and then they got separated, very common, and she was in detention. And it was pretty clear that the real reason they were detaining her, they could have let her go with her uncle, that kind of thing, was because they wanted to lure her parents to the detention center so they could arrest her parents who were undocumented. And that case went to the Carlos and Peter Shea filed a lawsuit arguing that the Immigration Service should not have the right to detain children. That case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, yes, they do. That the Immigration Service has the constitutional and statutory authority to detain children, migrant children. And we have detained migrant children ever since that. And the Supreme Court remanded the case to the district court and said, immigration can detain children, but you should determine under what circumstances and what conditions. And so the case went back, and it took a few years, but a settlement was reached over the conditions that outline the conditions under which children can be detained. And again, you can Google that. It's called the Flores Settlement Agreement. And they've got to be held in a facility that is licensed by the state. It's there's got to be educational opportunities. There's got to be outside space. There's got to be health care provided, that kind of thing. But no matter what administration there has been since the 1980s, Democrat or Republican, the conditions are always in question. And so 3 years ago, Peter and Carlos called me up because they have the authority to go into any detention center that holds children. This case has been their life since the 1980s. And so they don't have the time to go visit every detention center. So they ask people to go as part of an inspection team. So I've been on these inspection teams for 3 or 4 times, and they asked me to go, instead of an ICE detention facility, they asked me to go to a Border Patrol detention facility, which was odd because the Border Patrol is not supposed to detain anyone for more than 72 hours. After 72 hours, they're supposed to turn them over to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or if they're children, they're supposed to turn them over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is not part of the Department of Homeland Security. It's actually part of the ICE. ORR is part of Health and Human Services, HHS. So they had heard that the Border Patrol was detaining children, not just families, but children, for more than 72 hours. When would we go and find out what was happening? So the Border Patrol is given 2 days notice that a team is coming. So I was a team of 7, mostly lawyers, 1 pediatrician, and yeah, everyone else was a lawyer. Many that were not immigration lawyers. And not everyone spoke Spanish, but I speak enough Spanish that I can interview children and adults on biographic information, what the conditions are like, and that kind of thing. And so we show up, and there's a list of over 300 children only at the facility. And we have the right under the Flores order to interview anyone we want to on that list. And so we started dividing up the list, and we were there for 3 days. I know you're not going to believe what I'm about to say, but it's true. The youngest child that was left on her own, separated at the border, was 2 years old. Okay. I didn't interview that 2-year-old, and I'll come back to that story in a minute, but one of my colleagues did. The youngest I interviewed was a 4-year-old who was with his 12-year-old brother. And when they were both from Honduras, and they'd come with an uncle. And here's the thing, around that time, earlier that summer, there was a lot of bad publicity for the Trump administration over what was called family separation. And it was parents who were being separated from their children. And after a lot of litigation and media coverage, Trump did give in and stop separating parents from their children. Although, if you've kept track of that story, they never had a plan on reunifying folks. And even after months and months, there were still a couple hundred children that were not reunited with their parents. And so anyway, but that isn't my story. My story is about these other kids who are separated from not their parents, but their grandparents, their older siblings, their aunts and uncles, or somebody who has brought them. It could be it could be a coyote too. It could be a smuggler. And so, and that goes on. Even today, that goes on. The parent separation from a child does not occur, but every day, even under the Biden administration, under Obama administration, when it's not the parent with the child, they're separated. And so that's who we had. The 300 that we had in Clint, Texas, were children that had been separated from an aunt, uncle, cousin, older sibling. And the two brothers that I interviewed they were brought by their uncle, and then they were separated. And they wanted to join their mother, who was in Miami, actually. And the reason I know that is because they had their phone number. When I interviewed them, the children often carry the phone numbers in their pocket. And we were permitted to keep our phone at Clint. At Dilley, Texas, we were not permitted to keep our phones. And so I called everybody's relatives or aunt or uncle and to confirm, to let them know where they were and that kind of thing, which is what the Border Patrol should have been doing. Anyway, these children had been kept more than 72 hours. They were kept, in some cases, 3 weeks. Most of them had been kept by the Border Patrol for at least 10 days. And here's the problem. First of all, it's a violation of the Flores Agreement. But secondly, the conditions at the Border Patrol facility it's like a jail, basically. It's not like a campus, the way, like a dormitory, the way the other facilities are. And so the 4 and the 12-year-old just stick in my mind, because again, I'm not completely fluent, but I speak enough, and I've been around kids, and the 4-year-old just wouldn't talk to me. The 12-year-old was very open and explained where they were coming from and told me about their mother and that kind of. And I asked him, why does your brother talk? And he said, oh yeah, he talks. I said, well, he's not talking to me. So I went to find the pediatrician, and I explained to the pediatrician, I don't know why, but this 4-year-old wasn't talking to me, and I'm not sure if there's something wrong. So can you come in? And so she was a lot smarter than me, and she walked into the room with a bottle of bubbles. And as soon as she walked in, she didn't even say anything. She started blowing bubbles, and that 4-year-old just completely opened up and started jumping with excitement, and he started talking to her very openly. And so, but it was clear, actually, when he spoke, he actually had a speech impediment. And what the older brother explained to us was that he had actually taken care of his younger brothers. Both parents had left when the younger brother was 6 months old. And so the older brother and aunt or uncle had to take care of, but he was primarily responsible for his kid brother. And so um, it was very clear that they were attached, as you might expect. And so the pediatrician and I wrote letters to the Border Patrol to make sure that they were never separated. And they weren't. I found out a couple weeks later that they did make it to Miami. But uh, I'm going to come back to the food in a minute. But the uh, the 2-year-old. So what our job was to follow a questionnaire about the conditions and basically write a declaration for each child to sign. And so we would type up what they told us, and then we would read it back to them, and then they would sign it. And but we had to print it. And so we had a printer in a bigger room that was more of a conference room that the Border Patrol let us use. And so I went to use a printer in that room. There were 2 different interviews going on at that time at opposite sides of the conference room. And one of the, there was 2 attorneys who were interviewing a 6-year-old, and the 6-year-old was crying. And they walked the 6-year-old over to the other interview that was going on, and it looked like a teen mom who was being interviewed with a 2-year-old on her lap. And as soon as they walked the 6-year-old over there, what I thought was a teen mom calmed down the 6-year-old. And I printed my thing and I left the room. At lunch, I asked the interviewers what was going on, and they said, and because the math didn't quite work. It was possible, but the math didn't quite work out. I thought, oh, these are her 2 daughters, but no one in that facility was over the age of 18 because it was children. And so I guess it's possible, but it would have been unusual for her to have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so I asked what was going on, and I said, was that the mom? And said, no, she wasn't even related to them. They were all housed in the same room because they had rooms of 20, 30, 40 people in the same room. And the 6-year-old and the 2-year-old had been separated. They weren't, the 6-year-old and 2-year-old were not related either. They had been separated from their relatives at the border. And this 15-year-old, she was either 15 or 16-year-old teen, was there just out of the kindness of her heart, started caring for them, and they were attached to her. And so the food, they were prepared. They bragged to us when we got there. We met with, I don't know, a dozen Border Patrol officers bragging. One of the things they bragged about was that they served 3 hot meals a day. The breakfast was instant oatmeal where you pour hot water in. That was a hot breakfast. The lunch was Maruchan instant noodles, a cup of noodles that you pour hot water in. The dinner was a burrito, a frozen burrito that you zapped in the microwave. Those were the 3 hot meals. I interviewed 2 nursing mothers, and they were not provided with any other nutrients, the mothers, even though they were nursing. They didn't know, they were not told that there was formula available for the children until I asked one of the guards, is there at least formula? Because she's saying that she's not producing, one of the mothers, enough milk. And they said, oh yeah, all they have to do is ask, And I told them, did they tell you? And they said, no. And so I won't get into the rest of the reasons for ending ICE detention, but there's an average of 10 deaths a year in ICE detention. The United States spends $7 billion a year on immigration detention, and private prison companies like Geo Group and Core Civic, they make $1 billion each a year from immigration detention. And yeah, so that's my first reason for closing the place down. What's my next photograph? So that was last September, right? Del Rio, Texas, when the Border Patrol was turning back Haitians at the border. And there was an Inspector General report that just came out a couple weeks ago that I concluded what it's pretty obvious that the Border Patrol used excessive force. But they did say that, and this isn't a great picture, there's some pictures of what looks like whips and the report and the Border Patrol said, no, those were not whips. Those were long, extra long horse reins. In other words, it was just part of the rein. And they said that they weren't whipping anybody with it. They were just like making sounds in the air. And so this happens to be, of course, a group of Black migrants. And at the border, it's bad at the border, okay? We, again, pre-pandemic, the clinic goes to the border as well. We have our own cases here in San Francisco, but we go on these trips at the border, and the border has a priority list, if you will. And at the bottom of the list are Black migrants. And it's always been very evident that if you're Black, even if you're Latinx Black, you're at the lower end of the totem pole. But if you're from Africa or Haiti or Jamaica, you're down at the end. It's bad enough for people from this Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. But it became very evident a few weeks ago when Ukrainian migrants, and listen, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I believe that Ukrainians deserve refugee status as well. But at the southern border, Ukrainians automatically jumped at the head of the line a few weeks ago when they showed up at the U.S. southern border. And so what I want to talk about is how broken the asylum system is. And that's pretty much what I do and what the immigration clinic does. There are over 500 cases. I probably handle 3 or 4 of those. The rest of those 500 cases are handled by 4 very hardworking attorneys and paralegals. And I have a picture of some of them in a minute. And so I'm spoiled. I do mostly the appellate stuff, but I have some individuals. And it's cases involving domestic violence, gang violence, cartel violence, and so in 1987, I was very fortunate to be asked to help in a case that went to the Supreme Court called INS versus Cardoso Fonseca. And in that case, the Supreme Court had to determine what does it take to be eligible for asylum. And we won that case arguing that you shouldn't have, I'm trying not to be too technical here in terms of legalese, but for asylum, the Supreme Court held in Cardoso Fonseca, you don't have to show that it's more likely than not that you're going to be persecuted. You do not have to show that it's more likely than not that you're going to be persecuted. Another way of saying it is you don't have to show that there's a 51% chance that you're going to be persecuted. Because why? Because asylum is a humanitarian, there's a humanitarian purpose behind asylum. In fact, in that decision, in the 6-3 decision, which included Antonin Scalia in the 6, okay? The Supreme Court wrote, he didn't write the majority, it's Justice Stevens. He wrote, in fact, and this is his language, that a showing of 10% likelihood of persecution is a reasonable possibility that someone might get persecuted. And so it's very generous language that the Supreme Court uses in Cardoso-Fonseca. But unfortunately, the immigration judges, asylum officers, and the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is an administrative appellate body that that pretty much tells what immigration judges do. That's what the Board of Immigration Appeals, they're above immigration judges. They interpreted the term 10% and reasonable possibility. What I'm about to say is going to sound plausible to mean that if a reasonable person fears persecution, then you should get asylum. If a reasonable, and that sounds, oh, okay, that's the same, isn't it? If you say there's a reasonable possibility of persecution, isn't that the same as if a reasonable person fears persecution? Again, believe me, you can think about this at home. There's a difference. A reasonable person who has a 10%, let's say you might win something and there's a 10% chance you might win. A reasonable person might say, no, I don't want to take that chance. But there's still a reasonable possibility, according to the Supreme Court, that you might win. That's all it takes. And so I've spent a lot of my life since that decision in 1987 trying to convince immigration judges that they're wrong, that they're taking the wrong approach. And they use all kinds of different devices to deny asylum. Oh, that there's some discrepancies in what the person said. They were attacked by 3 people in their application, but in court they said it was 4 people. They said that the attack took place in June, but in their application it says July. Believe me, those are the kinds of things that judges look at to say, oh, well, that makes a person not credible because there's inconsistencies. And ignoring all along that the vast majority of asylum applicants are suffering from post-traumatic stress, which we have a hard enough time. Those of us who are not suffering, I may be suffering actually, but those of us who are not suffering from PTSD have a hard enough time remembering minor things like that with exactitude. And so, but it's that kind of excuse that's given. And so you can Google something called TRAC, T-R-A-C, at Syracuse University. It's the Transactional Resource Action Center. They collect data from the immigration, from DHS and ICE and Border Patrol. You can Google the name of any immigration judge in the country and find out what his or her asylum approval rate is and denial rate. And so in the same office in Atlanta or San Francisco or Portland or Los Angeles, where the cases have got to be the same, right? You will find, for example, one of the attorneys that was co-counsel in Cardoso-Fonseca, she became an immigration judge in San Francisco, Dana Marks. She just retired. Her asylum approval rate, because she understands Cardoso-Fonseca, was 97%. That was her approval rate. In San Francisco, there are immigration judges whose asylum approval rates are 12%. In Los Angeles, there are 2 immigration judges in Los Angeles whose asylum approval rates are 1.2%. There's a guy who was a former student of mine who became an immigration judge. And I'm gonna name his name because it's all public. Joran Lyons. He became an immigration judge in San Francisco. His asylum approval rate in San Francisco was 70%. Okay. Could be better. He moved to Portland 3 years ago, where his asylum approval rate is now 22%. You know, and I'm 100% sure it's because the community here was kind of keeping him honest because he worked for the Asian Law Caucus before he became an immigration judge. Okay. And they were kind of keeping him honest. And so in Portland, nobody knows who the hell he is. And so it really pisses me off when I see that kind of data. And so that's why the asylum system should be abolished, and why the opposite of what we see. So in criminal law, even though it's not done correctly either, but in criminal law, there's a presumption of innocence, right? And you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody's guilty. I think that kind of flip-flop should apply in asylum, that there should be a presumption of eligibility. And unless the government can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person's not going to be persecuted, then you should grant asylum. Because think about it. If you're going to make a mistake, the mistake you should make is grant asylum to somebody who's not going to be persecuted, rather than making a mistake by deporting somebody who ends up getting persecuted. Okay, so what's my next picture? Okay, so that photograph was given to me by some friends in San Jose. It's dated May 1st, 2006. And Ariana's too young. Some of you in the back are too young. So in 2006, May Day, 2006, there was a massive protest by immigrants and immigrant rights advocates across the country, because people were pissed off at a legislation that had passed the House of Representatives. It was called the Sensenbrenner bill. It had things in it like bounty for helping to catch an undocumented immigrant. Like it was inviting bounty hunters. It had all kinds of kooky things. And so people were afraid that it was going to be passed in the Senate. And so I know there was a movie named A Day Without Mexicans, right? But it was something like that, that people, and it wasn't organized. If there's an immigrant rights organization that claims that they organized that day, they're lying. There were massive demonstrations like that in New York, in Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago. It was organized by Spanish-speaking radio stations. They were outraged, and they did this network, and they just told people, don't go to work. Let's all protest May 1st. And that's what happened. They actually closed down 101 in Santa Clara County. And I wish this could have been kept up, because it was protests like that. That had an influence on Barack Obama, who 2 years later was elected president. And incidentally, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, listen, they both voted for before Donald Trump's wall, they both voted for the Fence Act, okay? They voted for putting up a fence along the border, okay? So it's not all Democrat versus Republican on this kind of stuff. But that did influence him. And I think, and other protests from Dreamers influenced him. And that's what led to Daca. And Daca, which some of you are aware of, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, it's for a subset of Dreamers who are mostly folks who grew up here as children, that they're, well, the standard version, it's parents brought them, and the kids grew up here and went to college and that kind of stuff. And so much of that is true. And so Congress never passed the DREAM Act, which would have granted legalization and amnesty and a green card for Dreamers. And so instead in 2012, Obama issued an executive order granting DACA, which is not a law, it's just an executive order. And DACA has two parts to it: a promise not to deport and an employment authorization, an EAD. So there's two parts of DACA: employment and a promise not to deport. That is being threatened right now. The state of Texas, because Trump tried to terminate it, but he screwed up. And Texas sued Biden and arguing that DACA is not valid. And it was argued in the Court of Appeals in New Orleans, which is the Fifth Circuit, last week. And there is some concern that Texas is going to win on the employment part, because the argument that prevailed in the lower court was that, yeah, if you don't want to deport somebody, that's fine. You know, it's kind of prosecutorial discretion. If you don't want, you can't force you to deport somebody. But an employment card, the lower court judge felt that that's too substantive, that a president can't grant employment authorization without congressional approval. And what I worry about is that if that gets to the Supreme Court, I don't have faith in the Supreme Court that they would view it within the discretion of the executive to grant employment authorization. And there are an estimated 10 to 12 million undocumented folks in the United States. And somebody asked me, who asked me this? Somebody just asked me the other day. Oh, I was giving a lunch presentation at a law firm downtown. And the woman who interviewed me was very nice and said, oh yeah, you did Cardoso Fonseca, you founded the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, but tell us about something you felt bad about, or that one of your bad cases. And so I'll tell you that one of my worst memories is saying goodbye 10 years ago to a man who was going to be deported the next day. And I lost the tail end of his case. He was represented by very competent counsel. He was a man, no crime, never crime, 25 years in the United States, held 2 jobs from Mexico, undocumented, he and his wife undocumented, 2 US citizen children. And he was, they don't know why, but somebody walked into the back room of the restaurant at the Hilton Hotel in Emeryville, and he was arrested. They came looking for him. He was arrested, put in deportation proceedings, got bailed out, but his immigration attorney did a great job and won something called cancellation of removal, where the immigration judge can let you stay here and give you a green card, actually. If you've lived here for more than 10 years, you're a person of good moral character. But the third requirement is the hardest, that you have to show extreme and unusual hardship, very unusual hardship. And so the judge granted it, said that, yeah, you got these 2 US citizen children, and the son, who at that time was about 10 or 11, would suffer psychological, emotional damage. And the daughter was going to Berkeley, actually. And anyway, so she won. The immigration judge granted that. But government attorneys, I guess they don't have anything better to do. They filed an appeal of that case to the Board of Immigration Appeals, and the Board of Immigration Appeals reversed and said, no, this is not any unusual hardship. This is any kind of this is like any other kind of hardship. If somebody's going to be separated from their parents, it's like, you know, people lose their parents all the time. Some parents have to go to jail. This is not that unusual. And so, so they reversed, And then they appealed, that attorney also appealed to the Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit, and Ninth Circuit said, no, this is a matter of discretion and we don't review discretionary decisions. And so that was it. And the daughter heard me give a talk like this. And so the daughter came to see me at USF and said, can you help my father? Because I heard there's this new discretionary thing. In 2011, Obama did something else called the Morton Memo. It was prosecutorial discretion. Long list of criteria on whether or not somebody should be granted permission to just stay here. Because Obama said, I'm just going to go after gang members. I don't like what he said. He said, because I want to go after people with families, not gangbangers. And I didn't like that, because gang members have families too, but I'm digressing. And so, but he laid out all these criteria for being able to stay here. And so Mr. Martinez met all the criteria. He had lived here all this time. He never had any crime, had all this community support. So we put in an application for prosecutorial discretion, had like 100 letters. He was a soccer coach. He was a churchgoer. It was a packet this big. And I know a lot of people that work in Washington. I knew a lot of people that work for Obama. I know a lot of people that work for Joe Biden. I called everybody I knew that worked at DHS, at Department of Justice. They all said, yeah, this guy should be granted prosecutorial discretion, but it's out of our hands. It's up to the local head of ICE. And he denied it. He said, he's no different. He's no different from any other Mexican who lives here for 25 years who has US citizen children. Why should I? So he denied it. And so I went to say goodbye to him the night that I'd get an airplane. And so the problem is there's a 10-year bar. If you've lived in the United States for more than 10 years, if you live in the United States for more than 1 year, undocumented, and you leave the country, you're subject to a 10-year bar. And so I had to think about it recently because it's now 10 years. And so his daughter's filing an I-130 for him, but they've been separated for 10 years. Okay. What's my next picture? That's why. Okay, so so those are two aggravated felons. The one on the right is Lundy Coy. I'm sorry, the one on the left is Lundy Coy with her sister Linda Coy, and the one on the right is a guy named Phone Yu. And there's an effort going on right now trying to get a governor's pardon for him, the guy on the right. And this is where I get into why we shouldn't be deporting anyone. They both entered, but this could happen to anyone. Every day we deport people from the United States who are classified as aggravated felons. Every day. If you are convicted of an aggravated felony, your deportation hearing lasts 5 minutes. The issue is it an aggravated felony? And if it is, there's no relief. Okay. The footnote is that there's something, if you're going to be tortured, you might get protection by the Torture Convention, but it's very difficult to meet that burden. So your hearing is usually 5 minutes. And so that's given rise to a whole new area of law called criminalization, where people specialize in trying to argue that convictions are not moral turpitude crimes or not aggravated felonies, or they try to catch it before a plea deal is reached. The San Francisco Public Defender's Office has a big immigration unit, and that's what they do, is to try to, if they're going to plead people out, they make sure it's not a deportable offense, that kind of thing. I'm a little bit worried about the new district attorney and whether or not she's going to go along with that. And I was I'm public supporter of Chesa, okay. And so but they were both convicted of aggravated felonies. He murdered somebody, and she was caught with 7 ecstasy pills on campus when she was a freshman in college. And when a police officer, she was kind of high, she and her boyfriend, when she was a freshman in college, and a police officer saw them, and he just said to her, "Do you have any drugs on you?" And she said, "Yeah, I have 7 ecstasy pills." And she said, "But they're not all for me." And so they charged her with distribution. And she had a terrible immigration lawyer, I mean, a terrible criminal defense lawyer who said, "Oh, you have a green card. You enter as a refugee, but now you have a green card. So this isn't going to affect it," which was wrong because it was an aggravated felony distribution. And so after 13 years, she finally won her case because she got her conviction set aside. But there have been 600 other Cambodians who have been deported who couldn't get their convictions set aside. And nobody knows. I got her a pardon in Virginia. I got Lundy Coyle, but the pardon wasn't good enough because there are 2 kinds of pardons in Virginia. One is a full pardon for people who were not guilty, and one is a pardon for somebody who has led a good life. And that's the kind of pardon she got. And that's not good enough for immigration purposes. So Governor Newsom is being asked for this man to be given a full pardon for his murder, okay? And otherwise he's going to get deported. And here's the thing, and this is the problem with Obama jumping on gangbangers. Dianne Feinstein threw me out of her office 10 years ago, trying to talk her into providing some kind of relief for people who have been convicted of aggravated felonies. Same with Nancy Pelosi, but there's somebody else I'm thinking of. Anyway, some other progressive person. Anyway, but they won't listen because, hey, they're gang members. And the thing you have to remember about everyone who's a criminal who has been deported is that they've all served their time. This is not a way of avoiding your jail sentence. You are turned over to ICE after you complete your sentence. And the reason I have both Linda and Lundy's picture up there is that Linda was also convicted of a crime that was considered an aggravated felony. It was also drug related. So they partied, okay? But Linda, who was only 18 months younger than Lundy, was born in Virginia. In other words, after their family came as refugees, then Linda was born. And so it's just, it's a picture of what's wrong with the system, because they both serve their time, but yet you have this other jeopardy that you have to face. And to me, yeah, I mean, I even have students that debate me on this. You know, they say, "Oh yeah, but they're here and they violated a condition of being an immigrant," and that kind of stuff. I understand that, but you know what? The criminal justice system is satisfied with them. Let the criminal justice system deal with it, not immigration. Okay, so the next picture is, so was part of my staff, and the person in the center, Jacqueline, she's like the most dedicated immigration lawyer I know, and the best asylum lawyer I know. And pretty much everyone in that picture is leaving or is about to leave because they got higher paying jobs, okay, with kids in need of defense. And one of them was working for the San Francisco Bar Association. The other one of the students on top is working for ACLU in New York. And you can get a picture like this of every community-based organization in San Francisco. I admire them so much. For everybody is overworked. Everybody we have to worry about ourselves and our own secondary trauma. And they have to worry about it because of the next slide. Because of who you face in the immigration court. And immigration judges, I already hinted at how inconsistent they are. Well, let me tell you about two immigration judges, okay? One is a guy named Nicholas Ford, who he was a kind of a superior court judge in Chicago. And he was constantly being reversed by the Court of Appeals as a criminal judge in Illinois for being biased against Blacks and for using racist language in court. Okay. So he was rewarded by Attorney General William Barr by being appointed to be an immigration judge in San Francisco. So San Francisco ended up with this guy, Nicholas Ford, as an immigration judge. And it didn't take long, because after a year of him being here, the National Lawyers Guild got every community-based organization to sign a letter protesting about him being racist and just always biased against people of color in his courtroom. And that's who's in the immigration courtroom. And there was an internal investigation by the Office of Inspector General, DHS, and they kind of slapped him on his wrist, but he resigned. He resigned last summer. So I do mostly appellate stuff, and I usually lose, because the cases that I take are not from our caseload. The cases that I take are from a caseload that is kept by an organization called Catholic Legal Immigration Network. They have a list of people who represented themselves in detention, and you can't introduce anything new. You're just stuck with the record that they have, and it's usually a bad record. But I remember losing one case that I thought really should have won at the Board of Immigration Appeals. And the Board of Immigration Appeals, they can rule. It doesn't have to be more than one member of the board. And so I looked this one guy up who ruled against us. And what was his name? I'm trying to remember what his name was, because you can look it up. Anyway, he was originally appointed by the Obama administration and by Eric Holder, the AG's appointment. And he was, he had an asylum denial rate of 94%. So I looked that up. He was rewarded by being elevated to the Board of Immigration Appeals by either Jeff Sessions or William Barr, okay? And so I looked him up to see what his background was and found out that he had this asylum denial rate of 94%, and that a complaint had been filed against him for threatening a 2-year-old in his courtroom who was making noise. And there was another person in the courtroom who witnessed this, who filed a complaint. He said to the little kid who was making, "If you don't shut up, I'm going to sick my dog on you." And so the kid was quiet. And then about 30 minutes later, the kid, and the same thing said, "And now I'm going to go get my dog if you don't shut up." And so, and then the other judge I would talk about, there's a guy named Weil, W-E-I-L. There was a lawsuit that failed, the ACLU filed, that right now you have a right to an attorney at government. You have a right to an attorney in deportation hearings, but there's not a government expense. You either have to find a pro bono attorney or a legal aid office, or you have to be able to afford one. They don't appoint one for you like they do in a criminal case, right? And so ACLU thought that doesn't make sense for kids. Kids should have a right to an attorney. And so they sued and lost. But in the process of that lawsuit, they deposed a senior immigration judge who was in charge of training immigration judges. His name was Weil, W-E-I-L. And in his deposition, he said, kids can represent themselves. I teach 3-year-olds about asylum all the time. I can teach a 3-year-old how to represent themselves. And this is the caliber of people that you get, that you can get in the immigration court. Now, I know there's bad judges everywhere, okay? But Zoe Lofgren introduced legislation 2 months ago that would redo the immigration court system, give them more independence, and hopefully would attract higher caliber people. And so maybe that will get somewhere. But right now, that's why the immigration court system has to go. So that's my end of why everything has to be abolished dealing with immigration. So thank you. We have a minute for questions. 1 minute. For comments. Yeah.
This is so stunning, like the level of insanity that's being built into this. I understanding that your solution is abolish it all, like burn it down, start over. Would you say that the problem is saying, who the hell tells a 2-year-old? I don't think not have kids, grandkids, but do you think it's at its core corrupted and corroded just out of straight up just racism on pretty much every individual involved, or is it something in, I guess, the training
Right.
and the structure?
I think it's all that. For sure, the immigration law and has manifested itself in systemic racism. Just even the selection system, certain rules and requirements, they go back to a time when things were racist. For example, there was a recent case. There's a lawsuit. There is a law that if you enter without inspection, it's a misdemeanor. Okay, if you cross the border without inspection, it's a misdemeanor. Well, the legislative history of that shows that that was designed to punish Mexicans. Okay, and people have argued that in defense in those cases unsuccessfully for 20 years, with one exception. Last year, there was a Nevada federal judge who, her background is she was a Vietnamese refugee. Okay, don't you love it? And she ruled, you know what? That is a racist law. And so that law should be thrown out. She's the only federal judge who's ever ruled that way. But I think racism is a problem. I don't know where they get these clowns from. I don't know. But and you just